At 10:47 in the morning on August 3, 1946, Gefreiter Hans Müller stood at the summit of Mount Snowdon, covered in sweat and trembling despite the 54-degree temperature. He had been a prisoner for 14 months. He had hiked 73 miles across the Welsh mountains. He had climbed 3,560 feet of elevation in a single morning. He had nearly turned back from exhaustion twice. And now he was standing at the peak because he had seen photographs of Snowdonia in the camp library. Jagged mountains, glacial valleys, ancient lakes. Hans had been told by his unit commander that the photographs were British propaganda designed to make Wales seem more dramatic than it actually was. The guards had told him Snowdonia was a national park, protected since 1951, preserved for public access. Hans had believed none of it. He had worked on forestry crews for 5 months. He had cleared timber alongside 19 other German prisoners across North Wales. And now, on this August morning, he was standing at the summit, looking at a landscape he had been certain could not exist because he could not reconcile natural beauty with industrial warfare. The officer who had organized Hans's climb was Lieutenant David Hughes from Caernarfon. Hughes had been assigned to Camp 100 near Bridgend since its expansion in June 1945. He had processed 926 German prisoners when they first arrived. He had watched them organize weekly football matches. He had approved their request to study Welsh language 3 times, and he had seen every possible reaction to the Welsh landscape. But Hans's disbelief was profound. Hughes asked if Hans needed water. Hans explained in careful English that he had seen the summit. He wanted to know if the valleys below were real. Hughes confirmed they were real. Hans asked how mountains like this could exist so close to industrial cities. Hughes said Wales had always been both things simultaneously, wilderness and industry, nature and coal mines. Hans sat down on the rock and covered his face with his hands. Hughes waited. Camp 100 held 3,400 German prisoners of war in August of 1946. Most had been captured in France and Belgium. Wehrmacht infantry, experienced soldiers who had fought in the Ardennes, the Rhineland, the Ruhr. They had surrendered to British and American forces between December 1944 and May 1945, been shipped to England, then transferred to Wales. South Wales received more prisoners than most regions because the landscape was similar to parts of Germany and the local economy needed labour. Forestry work, farm labour, coal mines, land reclamation. The prisoners were not required to work under Geneva Convention rules, but most volunteered out of necessity. The pay was 6 shillings per week in camp credits. The credits could be used at the camp canteen to buy cigarettes, chocolate, writing materials, newspapers. The prisoners could not believe the mountains were real. Oberfeldwebel Dieter Kraus had been at Camp 100 since July 1945. Before the war, he had been a geography teacher, secondary education. He had taught at schools in Stuttgart and Frankfurt. The Americans captured him in March 1945 after his unit was overrun near Remagen during the Rhine crossing. He spent 2 months in an American processing centre in France before being transferred to British custody and sent to Wales. He arrived at Camp 100 expecting harsh conditions, forced labour in coal mines, minimal food, strict discipline. Instead, he found a camp with educational opportunities, outdoor work assignments, and 3 meals a day that included fresh vegetables. Kraus did not trust it. He had been trained to recognize Allied psychological operations. The British were trying to break German morale by creating an artificial environment of natural beauty. The photographs of Snowdonia were certainly enhanced or manipulated. The claims about national parks and public land access were British propaganda designed to demonstrate cultural values that Germany supposedly lacked. Kraus organized analysis among the prisoners, not rebellion, intellectual analysis. He established a group of educated prisoners who met weekly to discuss camp conditions and evaluate British claims. The group reviewed all camp materials, photographs, maps, geological surveys, historical documents. They analyzed everything for signs of deception. In July 1946, Kraus's group examined photographs of Snowdonia that had been placed in the camp library. The photographs showed dramatic mountain peaks, glacial valleys carved during the last ice age, lakes reflecting clouds and mountains. The landscape appeared untouched by human activity. Krauss's group concluded the photographs were obviously manipulated. No landscape could be that pristine in an industrialized nation. The scale was exaggerated through photographic techniques. The British had enhanced the images to create an impression of natural abundance. To suggest that Britain possessed wilderness, Germany had destroyed through industrial expansion. Hans Müller had attended 4 of Krauss's analysis meetings before the forestry assignment. Hans was 25 years old. He had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1940. He had fought in France, then the Eastern Front, then the Western Front. The Americans captured him near Cologne in March 1945. Hans had spent 3 months in American custody before being transferred to British control in June. Hans had believed Krauss's theories about manipulated photographs because the alternative seemed impossible. If Britain truly preserved wilderness alongside industry, if natural beauty existed so close to coal mines and cities, then Germany had lost the war to a nation with different priorities. Hans preferred to believe the British were exaggerating. The forestry program began in March 1946. Krauss proposed volunteering for it during a group meeting. The strategy was simple: participate in outdoor work to observe actual Welsh landscape. Compare direct observation with propaganda photographs. Assess whether the dramatic scenery was localized or representative. If Snowdonia was as beautiful as claimed, they would see it. If it was propaganda, they would discover evidence. Krauss recruited 20 men for the program. Hans volunteered immediately. The work would be physical, but would provide answers. They would work in forests near Snowdonia. They would see the real whales, not the carefully selected images in camp publications. The first forestry assignment began on March 18th. The crew travelled to Bedgelert Forest in 2 military trucks with an escort of 3 British guards. The drive took 2 hours. They arrived at the forest site at 09:30 hours. Hans stepped out of the truck and looked around. The forest was real, ancient oak trees mixed with planted conifers, the ground covered in ferns and moss, a river running through the valley. Hans could see mountains in every direction. Not small hills, actual mountains with exposed rock faces and snow still visible on the peaks in March. This matched the propaganda photographs. But Hans noticed something else. The forest showed evidence of human management. Trees marked for cutting, cleared areas where harvesting had occurred, paths maintained for vehicle access. The landscape was beautiful, but it was not untouched wilderness. It was managed nature. The work supervisor was Gareth Williams from Bedgelert. Williams was 48 years old, a forestry officer for the Forestry Commission. He explained the work in English, which Hans translated for the other Germans. They would thin overgrown sections. They would clear deadfall. They would prepare areas for replanting. The work required knowledge of forestry management and physical stamina. Williams said the forest had been here for centuries. Parts of it were ancient woodland. Parts had been planted during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Forestry Commission managed it for timber production and conservation. Hans asked if the mountains were protected. Williams said yes. Snowdonia was designated for national park status. The process was not yet complete, but the principle was established. The mountains and valleys would be preserved for public use. Hans found Williams' explanation confusing. If Britain was preserving mountains while fighting a total war, it suggested priorities that made no sense to Hans. Resources should be allocated to military production, not landscape conservation. Unless the British were so confident of victory that they could afford to plan for post-war recreation even before the war ended. Hans and the other prisoners began work on March 19th. The labour was demanding. They cut trees with handsaws. They cleared brush with axes. They hauled logs with manual winches. By April 1946, Hans had worked 6 weeks in the forest. He had learned to identify Welsh trees by bark and leaf: oak, ash, birch, rowan. He had learned that the Forestry Commission employed both local civilians and German POWs. The civilians treated the Germans as co-workers rather than enemies. One civilian forester, Dylan Thomas from Caernarfon, shared his lunch with Hans. They ate together and talked about trees. Dylan had worked in forests for 25 years. He asked Hans about German forests. Hans described the Black Forest and the Bavarian Alps. Dylan said he hoped to visit Germany someday. Hans found this remarkable. Dylan was talking about tourism while Germany was occupied rubble. On May 2nd, Hans's crew was assigned to work near Lyn Lydor, a glacial lake below Mount Snowdon. The work involved clearing paths for public access. The crew travelled to the site by truck. They hiked 3 miles from the road to the lake. Hans saw Snowdon for the first time. The mountain rose 3,560 feet directly in front of him. Steep slopes, rocky summit, ridges extending in multiple directions. The lake reflected the mountain perfectly. Hans stared at it. The scene looked exactly like the propaganda photographs. The same dramatic peaks, the same pristine water, the same sense of untouched nature. Hans told himself the viewing angle was carefully chosen. From other perspectives, the landscape would look ordinary. The path clearing work required 2 weeks. Hans spent every day hiking to the lake, working on paths, hiking back. Each day, he saw the mountain from different angles. Each view was equally dramatic. The landscape was not a photographic trick. It was genuinely spectacular. Williams explained that Snowdon was the highest peak in Wales. The Welsh name was Ir Wydfa. The mountain had been climbed by people for centuries. There were multiple routes to the summit. A railway had been built to the top in 1896. Williams offered to arrange a climb for interested prisoners. Hans said yes immediately. The climb was organised for August 3rd. Hans and 15 other prisoners agreed to participate. Kraus was among them. The group travelled to Llanberis in military trucks with Lieutenant Hughes and 4 guards. They started the climb at 6:30 hours using the Llanberis path. The path was well maintained. Stone steps in steep sections, marker posts at intervals. Hughes explained that thousands of people climb Snowdon every year. Families with children, elderly hikers, serious mountaineers. The mountain was accessible to anyone with reasonable fitness. Hans found this claim suspicious. If the mountain was as tall as stated, it could not be accessible to casual hikers. The climb must be easier than claimed. After 2 hours of hiking, Hans stopped being suspicious. The climb was genuinely difficult. The path gained elevation consistently. The air became thinner. His legs burned. His breathing became laboured. Around him, other prisoners were struggling. Kraus was breathing heavily and walking slowly. One younger prisoner, Johann Weber, had to sit down and rest. Hughes offered water and encouragement. He said they were halfway to the summit. The view from the top would be worth the effort. Hans doubted this. No view could be worth this much effort. They reached the summit at 10:47 hours. Hans stepped onto the rocky peak and looked in every direction. He saw mountains extending to the horizon, valleys carved by glaciers, lakes reflecting sky, the Irish Sea visible to the west. The Snowdonia range surrounding him in every direction, peak after peak, ridge after ridge, wilderness that seemed to extend forever. Hans had expected a localized scenic area surrounded by industrial development. Instead, he saw protected landscape as far as he could see. He turned to Hughes and asked how much of this was protected. Hughes said the proposed national park would cover 823 square miles. All of the mountains Hans could see would be preserved. Hans asked why Britain would protect so much land. Hughes said because the land was more valuable preserved than developed. The mountains provided water, recreation, cultural identity, natural beauty. These things had value beyond economic production. Kraus stood 10 feet away, staring at the view. Hughes approached and asked what Kraus thought. Kraus said the landscape was extraordinary. Hughes asked if Kraus still believed the photographs were manipulated. Kraus admitted they were not. Hughes asked what had convinced him. Kraus pointed to the valleys below. You could see the pattern of glacial erosion. U-shaped valleys carved during the Ice Age. Hanging valleys where tributary glaciers had joined main glaciers. Moraines marking where glaciers had deposited rock. Kraus said no photographic manipulation could create geological features consistent with 10,000 years of post-glacial evolution. The landscape was real. The British had been telling the truth. One of the other prisoners, a younger man named Carl Fischer, was crying. Not sobbing, just tears streaming down his face. Hans asked what was wrong. Carl said nothing was wrong. He was just understanding for the first time that Germany had lost the war not because of resources or tactics, but because of values. Because Britain could fight a total war and still plan to preserve 823 square miles of mountains for public recreation. Because a country that valued natural beauty enough to protect it during wartime was a country with different priorities than Germany had understood. Carl said he had spent 14 months believing British kindness was temporary. Now he understood it was structural. The British valued things beyond military power. Lieutenant Hughes noticed Carl crying and approached. He asked if Carl needed to rest before descending. Carl said no, he just needed a moment to process. Hughes said he understood. He said many British soldiers had similar reactions when they first saw Snowdonia. The mountains reminded people what they were fighting for. Not territory or ideology, but the right to live in a country that protected beautiful things. Hughes said the war had not been about conquering Germany. It had been about defending values that made life worth living. The mountains represented those values more clearly than any political speech could convey. The group descended at 1145 hours. The hike down took 3 hours. Hans was exhausted when they reached the trucks at 1445 hours. His legs shook, his feet hurt, but his mind was clear. He had spent 5 months believing he was participating in British propaganda. Now he understood he had been participating in British reality. The forestry work was not about demonstrating anything to German prisoners. It was about managing resources that had always been important and would remain important after the war. Hans returned to Camp 100 on August 3rd at 1830 hours. He found Kraus in the recreation hall reading a Welsh geography textbook. Hans sat down and told Kraus his conclusion. The photographs were accurate. The mountains were real. The preservation plans were genuine. Kraus listened and asked if Hans had considered that the entire experience might be staged. Perhaps the British had created a showcase wilderness area and carefully controlled prisoner access to it. Hans said that was possible, but unlikely. The geological features were too consistent. The civilian population treated the landscape as normal. The infrastructure for public access predated the war. Kraus asked what would convince Hans that skepticism was still warranted. Hans said at some point, skepticism became denial. The evidence was overwhelming. Kraus closed the textbook and said nothing. On August 15th, Hans's forestry crew was assigned to work near Bethusi Coed, a village in the Snowdonia foothills. The work involved river management and flood prevention. The crew spent 4 weeks clearing channels and reinforcing banks. During that time, Hans watched Welsh civilians using the landscape. Families picnicking by rivers. Hikers walking established trails. Climbers preparing for mountain ascents. Fishermen casting in clear streams. The landscape was not a protected museum. It was an actively used public resource. An elderly man told Hans that he had been coming to these mountains since he was a child. His father had brought him. His grandfather had brought his father. The tradition extended back generations. The man said the mountains were part of Welsh identity. Protecting them was not a luxury. It was a necessity for cultural continuity. Hans understood what the man meant. He had fought for Germany believing in industrial strength and military efficiency. He had lost. Now he was managing forests in a country that valued natural landscapes as much as coal mines. The British had not survived because they were richer. They had survived because they understood that some things should not be sacrificed for short-term advantage. Their landscape had roots deep enough in cultural memory to justify protection even during total war. Germany's landscape had been treated as raw material, fuel for industry, expendable in pursuit of military goals. By September 1946, Hans had worked on 9 different forestry projects across Snowdonia: Bedgelert Forest, Gwydir Forest, Bethusi Coed River Management, Llanberis Reforestation, Capel Curig Path Maintenance, Dolgelau Watershed Protection, Festiniog Timber Harvesting. Each project demonstrated the same pattern: landscape managed for long-term sustainability, conservation balanced with resource extraction, public access maintained as a priority. Hans reported these observations to Krauss one final time in September. Krauss said Hans had developed an emotional attachment to Welsh landscape that clouded his analytical judgment. Hans said perhaps, but emotional attachment was a valid response to genuine beauty. Krauss said time would tell whether British preservation lasted beyond the immediate post-war period. Hans stopped attending the analysis meetings. Camp 100 held German prisoners until repatriation was completed in 1948. Most prisoners returned to Germany between 1947 and 1948 as work assignments concluded. Hans was among the last groups to be repatriated. He arrived in Stuttgart on May 12, 1948. Stuttgart was heavily damaged. The city centre had been bombed repeatedly. The surrounding forests had been harvested for fuel during the harsh winter of 1946–47. Housing was scarce. Food was rationed. Hans spent his first night in Stuttgart in a displaced persons centre. The centre served dinner at 1900 hours, watery soup with potatoes and bread. Hans ate the soup and thought about the view from Mount Snowdon, the packed lunches in Begelert, the natural beauty that had been protected while Germany's landscape had been consumed. Hans found work as a forester in Bavaria. His experience with British forestry management made him valuable for post-war reforestation programs. He applied British techniques to German forests: sustainable harvesting, habitat conservation, long-term planning. Other foresters noticed his methods and asked where he had learned them. Hans explained he had been a prisoner in Wales. He had worked in Snowdonia. He had learned that forests were not just timber resources, but cultural assets requiring protection. In 1952, Hans was hired by the Bavarian Forestry Service as a management consultant. His job was developing policies for the Bavarian Alps. Hans applied principles he had learned in Wales: multiple-use management, conservation balanced with access, long-term sustainability. In 1955, Hans applied for permission to visit Wales. His request was approved. He arrived in Caernarfon on July 8th. He wanted to see Snowdon again. He stayed in a guest house in Llanberis. The next morning, he hiked the Llanberis path to the summit. The mountain was exactly as he remembered from August 1946. The same dramatic peaks, the same glacial valleys, the same sense that nature could create something beyond human ambition. Hans thought about Krauss's analysis meetings, the theories about manipulated photographs, the certainty that Britain could not truly value wilderness. Hans had spent 14 months questioning reality because accepting it required acknowledging different values. Hans found work as a forestry consultant for international conservation organizations. He married a German woman in 1957. They had 2 children. Hans continued working until retirement in 1983. He visited Wales 6 more times during his life. Each visit reminded him that the landscape was real and the values it represented were genuine. When asked about his experiences during the war, he would tell people about Camp 100, the forestry work, climbing Snowdon, the moment he understood that preservation was not weakness but wisdom. He would explain that he had learned more about priorities during his 2 years as a prisoner than he had learned in 5 years as a soldier. He learned that nations are defined not just by what they build, but by what they protect, not just by what they consume, but by what they preserve. Hans died on November 3, 1999 in Munich. He was 78 years old. His obituary mentioned his service in the Wehrmacht, his time at Camp 100, his work as a forestry consultant. The obituary did not mention Krauss's analysis group or the propaganda theories. But at his funeral, one of his children told the story of a young German soldier who cleared paths in Welsh forests and learned that some landscapes are worth protecting because they existed before nations and will exist after them. The story of a man who climbed Mount Snowdon and understood through exhaustion and beauty what victory meant. The story of a prisoner who became a conservationist because he recognized that the mountains he worked in represented values worth adopting. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers who learned unexpected truths. Real people, real transformations. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Wales, Germany, United States, New Zealand. Our community stretches across the entire world. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Hans Müller doesn't disappear into silence.